The winter wind crept across the prairie, carrying with it the faint smoke of lodge fires and the sound of drums echoing from a Lakota camp not far from the river. It was the late 1800s, a time when the frontier still whispered with danger and promise. In the small village on the edge of that wide, untamed land, a young woman stepped out into the night, her heart racing faster than the hoofbeats of wild horses she often heard beyond the fields. She had grown up among settlers who spoke of the Lakota people with both fear and awe. Yet tonight, her path crossed with theirs in a way she had never imagined. Her breath hung in the cold air as she adjusted, the shawl around her shoulders, every step reminding her that this night would change her life. Stories told by elders had warned of warriors who carried both fierce pride and unshakable silence. But the man she met was nothing like the shadows those stories painted. His presence carried strength, but his eyes held something gentler patience, like a river that waited for spring to melt the last of the ice. He was a Lakota warrior, known among his people for his loyalty and his ability to endure storms without wavering. For weeks, perhaps months, he had watched her from a respectful distance, never forcing words, never demanding trust, only waiting. The village where she lived was a place of worn timber cabins and dirt roads that turned to mud whenever the rains came. Life was hard, built on survival, not dreams. Yet there had always been a quiet longing inside her, something that reached beyond the fences and the rigid rules whispered by neighbors. When she first noticed the warrior, standing on the edge of a gathering where settlers and Lakota exchanged goods, she had felt a fear she could not name. Not because of his stance or the feathers braided into his hair, but because in that brief glance she saw something in him that unsettled her recognition. It was as if he understood the part of her she had always kept hidden. That recognition had lingered, night after night, until curiosity pushed her fear aside. She began to notice more the way he lowered his head in respect when speaking to the elders of his tribe. The care he gave to his horse, the way children in his camp ran to him with trust in their small hands. The image clashed with everything she had been told. She had been warned of warriors who brought nothing but danger. Yet here was one who carried himself like the earth itself, steady, unyielding but alive with hidden strength. Tonight was not born of chance. She had chosen to step beyond the safety of the village fires, into a world where her neighbors would never follow. The air was filled with the hum of drums, and in the glow of firelight, she saw him waiting near the edge of the gathering. He did not move closer, nor did he call her name. He simply stood, as though he had always known she would come. Her fear clung to her at first, whispering all the warnings she had ever heard. But the longer she looked at him, the more it loosened its grip. The night unfolded slowly, like the careful weaving of a story. He spoke little, his voice deep, each word carrying weight. She found herself telling him things she had never spoken aloud. Secrets about how trapped she felt, how her heart longed for something beyond walls and expectations. He listened, never interrupting, his gaze steady. When he finally spoke, it was not to answer her confessions with promises, but with the truth of his own. He had waited not for her to be ready to meet him, but for her to be ready to see herself. The hours passed unnoticed, the fire burning low until silence settled between them. In that silence was no judgment, no demand, only an unspoken choice. She felt the weight of it, the way her heart battled between fear of the unknown and the pull of something deeper. Every story she had heard told her to turn back, but every breath she took told her this was where she belonged. The warrior's patience had been a language all its own, a steady reminder that love was not the storm she had been taught to fear, but the shelter she never knew she needed. Yet even as she leaned closer, drawn into the warmth of his presence, a part of her trembled with doubt. The world outside this moment was still waiting, filled with eyes that would never understand. Tomorrow might bring whispers, anger, even division between the village and the camp. And still, she could not look away from him. His hand brushed against hers, rough and steady. And in that touch she felt both the strength of his people and the promise of something tender she had never known. The fire crackled, casting shadows across the lodge walls, and she closed her eyes as he pressed his forehead gently to hers. The world around them seemed to fall silent, and for the first time. She realized that love was not what she had feared, it was what she had been searching for all along. But the night was not yet over, and as the drums faded into the distance, a question lingered in the air, unspoken and heavy. Would the dawn bring them together in truth, or tear them apart before their story could even begin? The answer lay ahead, hidden beyond the edge of night. The fire had burned low, and the night pressed against the lodge like a silent witness. She sat beside the warrior, her thoughts tangled in fear and wonder. Though no words passed between them, she felt the weight of his presence like the steady heartbeat of the earth itself. His eyes reflected the glow of the flames, and though he said nothing, she sensed that he understood everything she was too afraid to say aloud. She wanted to ask what tomorrow might hold, yet her voice remained caught in her throat. Instead, she let the silence wrap around them, knowing that once the sun rose, their lives would no longer belong to the quiet world they had built in these few hours. Her thoughts drifted back to the village she had left behind. It was a place of rough cabins, where every creak of the floorboards and every whisper of the neighbors seemed to carry judgment. She had grown up surrounded by rules she never agreed to, rules that told her what she must fear, who she must trust, and how she must live. Her father had worked the land with blistered hands. Her mother had filled their home with stern words and quiet prayers, and the people around her had carried the same heavy truths that made life feel like a burden. In those days, she had thought love would be nothing more than an arrangement, a cold partnership sealed by necessity. But in the presence of this warrior, everything she had been told about love felt like a lie. He was different from anyone she had ever known. His movements were deliberate, each gesture carrying meaning. When he looked at her, it was not the way men in her village had looked at her before. There was no hunger, no careless gaze. Instead, there was a depth she could not name, as though he saw something in her soul she had never dared to uncover. It unsettled her, yet it drew her closer, like the pull of a river current too strong to resist. And still, beneath that quiet connection, a storm gathered. The world outside would not accept what had begun between them. The tension was not new. She remembered the nights when her village spoke in hushed tones about the Lakota people, painting them with words of fear and mistrust. They told stories of raids, of battles, of lives lost along the river. Yet when she glimpsed the Lakota camp by day, she saw families gathered, children playing, women weaving, men riding out across the plains. It was not the world she had been told to fear, but a world that pulsed with life. And now, sitting so close to one of their warriors, she wondered if all the warnings had been meant to keep her blind. The warrior's patience lingered in her thoughts. He had never approached her in haste, never spoken more than was needed. He had waited. She could see it now, every time she had caught sight of him at a trading post or across the fields. His eyes had not been those of a stranger, but of someone quietly waiting for the right moment. She wondered what it had cost him, this waiting. She wondered if his people knew, if they whispered of his silence when they gathered around their fires. And she wondered what her own people would say if they discovered where she was tonight. Her heart tightened at the thought of home. Her mother's sharp words would pierce her like knives if she knew. Her father's silence would be worse than anger, carrying disappointment heavy enough to crush her spirit. The neighbors would turn cold, their whispers curling like smoke through every cabin. And yet, even knowing the cost, she could not deny what she felt when she was near him. It was not the reckless fire she had been warned about, but something deeper, a calm and anchoring, as though she had finally found the place where she belonged. He broke the silence at last, his voice low and steady. He spoke of the land, of the river that cut through both their lives, of the storms that came each spring. His words were simple, yet each one carried meaning beyond the surface. He spoke of his people, of how they endured, how they held on to their ways, despite the weight of change pressing against them from all sides. His voice carried no anger, only truth, and she listened as though each word stitched itself into her heart. She realized then that he carried more than the strength of a warrior. He carried the stories of his people, the weight of their survival, the hope of their future. The night stretched on, but still she lingered. Her fear began to shift, not disappearing, but changing shape. No longer was she afraid of him, or of what might happen between them. Instead, She feared the world outside this firelight. She feared the choice that lay before her, the line that once crossed could never be undone. And yet her heart whispered that perhaps it was not a line to fear, but a path she was always meant to walk. The warrior did not reach for her, though she could feel the warmth of his hand near her own. He gave her space, letting her decide, letting her heart find its way. That patience, more than anything, bound her to him. It was not the passion of a fleeting moment, but the strength of something that could last. If only she was brave enough to claim it. But outside the lodge, the world stirred. She knew that whispers had already begun in the village, that people had noticed her absence. By morning, her name might be spoken in anger, her reputation questioned, her family shamed. The thought filled her with dread, yet it did not outweigh the pull of the present. Still, she could not ignore it forever. The dawn would come, and with it the weight of choice. The warrior's gaze never wavered. She felt as though he was asking her a question without words, a question she could not yet answer. Could she stand beside him when the world turned against them? Could she leave behind the safety of what she had always known to embrace, a love that defied every warning? The silence between them held that question, heavy and unspoken. Her breath caught as the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon. She knew the night was ending, and with it, the fragile shelter they had shared. She wanted to hold on, to stretch the hours longer, but time was merciless. He rose slowly, his movements as steady as the earth beneath them, and she felt her heart lurch with the fear of losing him. Yet he did not turn away. He looked at her with the same patience, the same quiet strength, as though he knew that this was only the beginning of a story neither of them could yet see the end of. She stepped toward him, torn between fear and longing. And in that moment, she understood the truth. Love was nothing like she had feared. It was not a storm that destroyed, but a force that demanded courage. And though the world outside would rage, she could not deny what had already taken root inside her heart. But as the sun broke fully over the plains, a sound rose in the distance. Faint murmur of voices carried on the wind from her village. She froze, her heart pounding as the reality of dawn settled around them. The night of waiting was over, and the day had come. The warrior's hand hovered near hers, steady and patient, but the choice was hers alone. And as the voices drew nearer, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which path she would choose. The morning sun rose slow over the plains, its light spreading across the cabins of the settlement and spilling into the circle of lodges by the river. What had been quiet in the night now stirred with voices, footsteps, and the sharp clang of tools. The young woman's heart raced as she stood between two worlds, feeling the weight of both pressing down upon her. Behind her lay the warmth of the fire, the silent strength of the Lakota warrior who had waited so patiently for her. Ahead of her were the voices of her people, calling her name with suspicion hidden in their tones. She pulled her shawl tighter, as though its fabric could shield her from the truth. The warrior said nothing, only watched her with the same steady gaze that had unsettled her since the first day she saw him. There was no demand in his eyes, no command to stay or go. Only patience, as if he knew the battle she faced was not with him, but with herself and the world that surrounded them. For a moment she wished he would reach for her, take her hand, and make the choice for her. But he did not. He would not. The choice had to be hers, and hers alone. She turned toward the village, her heart heavy with dread. Every step back felt like a betrayal, though she told herself it was not an ending. Not yet. The voices grew clearer, neighbors calling, men gathering, women whispering. Her absence through the night had already planted seeds of rumor, seeds that would soon grow into thorned vines of judgment. She knew what they would think. She knew what her mother's eyes would look like when she saw her, what her father's silence would mean. The fear of that was enough to knot her stomach, but behind it lingered something stronger, the memory of the warrior's quiet strength. When she entered the village, the whispers began at once. Faces turned, eyes narrowing, lips pressing together in suspicion. Some said nothing, their silence louder than words. Others muttered beneath their breath, their tones sharp with disapproval. She forced herself to walk steady, though her knees felt weak. She wanted to cry out, to tell them they did not know him, that he was not what they believed, but she said nothing. Her voice trapped behind the weight of their stares. Her mother stood in the doorway of their cabin, her face drawn tight. "Where have you been?" The words cut through the air. More accusation than question. "I walked," she answered, her voice small. It was not a lie, but not the truth either. Her mother's eyes searched her, looking for cracks, for signs, for proof of what the village already believed. Her father stood behind her, silent as always, his expression unreadable. Yet his silence felt heavier than any words her mother could have spoken. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet their eyes. The day stretched on, each moment thick with tension. The whispers did not stop. Every time she stepped outside, she felt them wrap around her like smoke. At the well, women fell silent when she approached. At the trading post, men glanced at her and then turned away. The world that had once seemed small and suffocating now seemed even smaller, its walls pressing in tighter with every breath. That night, she lay awake on her narrow bed, staring at the wooden beams above her. The memory of the warrior's voice lingered in her mind, steady and low, speaking of rivers and storms. She thought of his patience, of the way he had listened, of the way he had waited, and she thought of the eyes of her neighbors, sharp with judgment, eager to tear apart what they did not understand. The two worlds seemed farther apart than ever, yet she was caught between them, belonging fully to neither. Days passed, but the tension only grew. The warrior did not come to the village, but she knew he was near. She felt it in the way the wind carried the scent of smoke from his people's fires, in the distant sound of drums that reached her at night. Sometimes she thought she saw him at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting, but when she blinked, he was gone. The waiting became its own torment, pulling her in two directions at once. Meanwhile, the village grew restless. With the Lakota stirred again, fueled by fear and old wounds. Some men whispered of tightening defenses, of keeping watch at night, of driving the camp farther away. Each word sank into her like a blade. She wanted to cry out that they were wrong, that they did not know what she knew, that love could exist even here, in the space between their mistrust, but the words never left her lips. Her only comfort came from small moments stolen in secret. One evening she slipped away under the cover of dusk, her heart racing as she crossed the fields toward the river. He was there, waiting as though he had always known she would come. His presence alone steadied her. The silence between them, stronger than all the whispers of her village. "I cannot stay long," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You came," he answered simply. They walked by the river, their steps falling in rhythm. He spoke of his people's struggles, of promises broken, of lands shrinking under the weight of settlers pressing west. His words carried sorrow, but also resilience. She listened, her heart aching, realizing that his patience came not only from his nature, but from the battles his people had endured. To him, waiting was survival, a way of holding on when everything else was slipping away. In those moments, she felt the pull of something greater than herself, something larger than the whispers of her village or the fear of judgment. Yet even as she walked beside him, she knew the danger. If they were seen together, the whispers would ignite into fire. She would not only face shame, but the threat of violence, for the village feared what it did not understand. Fear often turned to anger. When she returned home that night, her mother's eyes burned with suspicion. "You are hiding something," she said, her voice sharp as flint. The young woman said nothing, though her silence was answer enough. The days that followed brought no peace. The village elders gathered often, their meetings filled with hushed debates that grew louder with each passing day. She heard fragments when she passed by, words like threat, danger, unwelcome, each word twisted inside her. For she knew they were not speaking of faceless enemies, but of the people who had shown her nothing but kindness, of the warrior who had given her patience when no one else ever had. And still, the world pressed closer. The settlers watched her, whispering whenever she walked by. The Lakota camp waited, patient yet fragile, aware of the storm brewing on the horizon. And in the middle stood the young woman, her heart pulled in two directions, her choices narrowing with every sunrise. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of fire, she stood again at the edge of the river. The warrior was there, his gaze steady, his silence filled with questions she could not yet answer. She felt the weight of both worlds pressing down upon her, the whispers of her village and the strength of his people colliding inside her chest. The air grew heavy, and for a moment it seemed as though the earth itself held its breath. She wanted to reach for him, to cling to the truth she had found in his presence. But she knew that with every step closer the danger grew sharper. The world would not wait forever. Soon, the storm would break, and she would be forced to choose. Yet still, she lingered, her heart caught in the space between fear and longing. And in that space, the story of their love remained unfinished. Suspended in the silence of a world that was not ready to let them be, the nights grew colder as autumn, pressed deeper across the plains. Each morning, the frost clung to the fields like a warning. Each evening, the wind carried with it a restlessness that set both village and camp on edge. Rumors moved faster than the river, fed by fear and old wounds that refused to heal. The young woman felt the weight of every whispered word, every sideways glance. Though she tried to walk with calm, inside her heart beat with unease. For she knew that time was running out. Her secret meetings with the Lakota warrior became harder to keep hidden. She slipped away under the cover of dusk, her breath quick and shallow as she crossed the fields. Sometimes she thought she heard footsteps behind her, the faint echo of suspicion following close. But still she went, drawn by something stronger than fear. Each night he was there, waiting with the same patience, his eyes steady, his silence filled with questions. And each night she felt the tension tighten, for their time together was growing shorter, threatened by the storm gathering all around. In the village, the elders' meetings grew louder. Words like threat, danger, and defense carried through the walls, seeping into every corner of life. Men spoke of guarding the river, of watching the fields at night. Some whispered of driving the Lakota farther west, out of sight and out of mind. The young woman listened from the shadows, her heart twisting, for she knew what they feared was not faceless strangers, but the people she had come to know, the warrior she had come to love. Her family's suspicion deepened. Her mother's eyes followed her every step, sharp and accusing. Her father said little, but the weight of his silence cut deeper than words. She could feel the distance growing between them, a gulf that no explanation could bridge. Each time she tried to speak, her voice failed her. What words could she offer that would not be met with disbelief, or worse, anger? She carried the truth like a hidden flame, burning brighter each day, even as it threatened to consume her. Meanwhile, the Lakota camp stirred with its own unease. The warrior spoke of tensions rising, of warnings carried by scouts who saw the settlers sharpening tools and watching the river with hostile eyes. He spoke of elders debating whether to move camp, whether to hold their ground or seek safety farther away. His voice was calm, but beneath it lay a shadow of sorrow. For he knew that the fragile peace could not hold forever. One night, by the river, she saw that shadow more clearly than ever. He stood looking out at the water, the firelight catching on the lines of his face. "There will be a day soon," he said softly, "when waiting will not be enough." His words chilled her, for she knew they were true. The patience that had bound them together was running thin. Worn away by fear and suspicion pressing in from both sides, she wanted to ask him what would happen then. But her voice caught in her throat. The question hung unspoken between them, heavy with dread. Instead, she reached for his hand, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his. He did not pull away. His hand closed gently around hers, steady and warm, and for a moment, the storm faded. But only for a moment. The whispers in the village soon grew louder than the silence by the river. One morning, she heard her name spoken in the trading post, sharp and accusing. A woman muttered that she had been seen walking late at night, that she lingered too near the river, that she was not to be trusted. The words spread like wildfire, twisting into harsher shapes as they passed from mouth to mouth. By evening, she felt the weight of every eye upon her, suspicion burning in their gazes. Her mother confronted her that night, her voice rising in anger. "Tell me where you go. Tell me the truth." The young woman stood frozen, her heart pounding. She wanted to speak, to tell her mother everything, but the words refused to come. Her silence was enough. Her mother turned away, her face pale with fear and fury, and her father's silence pressed down like stone. That same night, as the village slept, a group of men gathered by the river. She heard them as she slipped away, their voices low and grim. They spoke of keeping watch, of driving the Lakota out before danger came to them. Her breath caught as she realized what their words meant. It would not be long before suspicion turned to action, before waiting gave way to violence. When she reached the warrior, her fear spilled over. "They will come," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They will not wait much longer." He listened in silence, his hand resting on hers, his eyes steady, even as the storm gathered around them. "Then we must be ready," he said. His words carried no anger, only truth. But the truth was heavy, and it filled her with dread. The days that followed were sharper, each one edged with fear. The settlers tightened their watch, men carrying rifles as they moved through the fields. The Lakota camp grew quieter, its fires burning low, its people wary of every sound carried on the wind. The river that once connected them now felt like a line drawn in the earth. It's fragile and dangerous. The young woman lived in two worlds, each pulling her in opposite directions. In the village, she was met with suspicion and silence. In the camp, she found patience and strength, yet also the shadow of conflict that drew nearer with each day. She walked as though on thin ice, knowing that one misstep could shatter everything. One evening, she stood again by the river, the warrior at her side. The sky burned red with the setting sun, the air heavy with the weight of all that was unsaid. She felt the pull of the moment, the sense that they stood on the edge of something vast and irreversible. "They will come soon," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes," he answered simply. "What will happen?" He did not answer at once. His gaze lingered on the horizon, his silence heavier than words. At last he said, "The world will decide." His words struck her like a blow, for she knew they were true. The choice was no longer only hers, no longer only his. The storm that had been gathering was about to break, and when it did, no one would be untouched. That night, as she returned to the village, she saw men gathered with rifles, their faces grim, their voices sharp. They spoke of danger, of protecting their homes, of striking first before it was too late. Her heart pounded as she realized the time for whispers was over. The storm was no longer coming, it was here. She lay awake in her bed, the weight of dread pressing down like a stone. She thought of the warrior, of his patience, of his steady gaze. She thought of her mother's anger, her father's silence, her neighbor's suspicion. She thought of the river, of the thin line that separated two worlds now poised to collide. The next morning, the air was thick with tension. Men moved with purpose. Women whispered with fear. Children clung to their mother's skirts. The young woman felt it in every breath, in every heartbeat. Something was about to break. She knew it, and she feared it with every part of her being. As the sun rose higher, she slipped away once more, her heart pounding as she crossed the fields. At the river, the warrior was waiting, his eyes steady, his silence filled with questions. She felt the pull of the moment, the edge of the storm pressing close. The world seemed to hold its breath, and in that breathless silence, she knew they stood at the threshold of the climax, where every choice, every whisper, every step had led them. And still, the resolution remained unseen, suspended in the space between fear and hope, between love and the world that sought to tear it apart. The morning came heavy with silence. The village had risen early, men gathering by the river with rifles slung across their shoulders, their eyes sharp and restless. The women lingered at their doorways, whispering, clutching children close. Fear clung to the air thicker than the mist on the fields, and it pressed against every soul that lived there. The young woman walked among them with her shawl wrapped tight, her steps unsteady, her heart pounding as if it already knew what was coming. Across the river, the Lakota camp was alive with quiet motion. Fires burned low, horses stamped the ground, and watchful eyes scanned the horizon. The warrior stood at the edge of the water, tall and steady, his face unreadable. When she saw him, her heart leapt and ached all at once. He had been waiting, as always. But now the patience that had defined him felt like the last fragile thread. Holding 2 worlds apart, the men from her village gathered near the water's edge, voices low and tense. "We strike before they strike," one said. Another added, "We protect our own." Fear twisted their words, shaping them into something hard and dangerous. The young woman's father stood among them, his face grim but pale, his silence carrying as much weight as the rifles in their hands. She saw him hesitate, as though torn, but he said nothing. Her body trembled as she stepped closer. Unable to stay in the shadows any longer, she wanted to scream, to beg them to stop, but her voice faltered. It was not until she saw the warrior's eyes fixed on hers across the river that her courage returned. She stepped forward, her voice shaking but clear. "Please don't." Every head turned toward her, eyes narrowing, whispers rising. "She's with him," someone muttered. The words spread like fire, sharper than any blade. Her mother gasped, her face pale with disbelief. Her hand pressed to her mouth, as though to hold back her fear. The young woman did not turn away. Her feet carried her to the edge of the river, where she stood between the rifles of her people and the silence of the camp across the water. Her voice broke as she cried out, "You don't know them as I do. They are not what you believe. He is not what you fear." The men shifted, uneasy. Their fingers tightened around their rifles, yet doubt flickered in their eyes. Her father stepped forward then, his voice rough. "You've been meeting him?" The words carried more sorrow than anger. She swallowed hard and nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Yes. The air was thick. Each moment stretched taut. Across the river, the warrior did not move, his eyes fixed on her, steady and unwavering. His silence was a shield, his patience stronger than all the fear pressing in around them. One of the elders lifted his rifle, his voice sharp with fury. "Step aside, girl. This is not your fight." But she did not move. Her legs trembled, yet she stood her ground, her voice rising above the whispers. "It is my fight. Because love cannot be a threat. Because peace cannot come from fear." The words spilled from her with a strength she did not know she had, carried not only by her heart, but by the truth she had lived in the shadows. The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. The men wavered, their fear clashing with her defiance. Her father's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw not silence, but conflict a man, torn between duty and love for his daughter. His hand, rough from years of work, pushed down the barrel of the rifle nearest him. "Enough," he said, his voice steady, though low. The elder protested, his face flushed with anger, but the moment had shifted. Doubt spread among the men like cracks in ice. One by one, rifles lowered, not in surrender, but in uneasy hesitation. The air was still charged, the storm not yet past, but for the first time there was space to breathe. Across the river, the warrior gave no triumphant cry, no sign of victory. He simply remained still, his patience unbroken, his gaze steady on her. She felt the weight of his silence, the way it carried more than words ever could. In that moment, she knew that what they had was not only about love, but about survival. About choosing something stronger than fear. The men turned away slowly, muttering, their anger simmering, but no longer spilling into violence. Her father lingered, his eyes locked on hers, heavy with unspoken questions. At last, he said quietly, "You've chosen your path." His words were not harsh, but they carried the finality of truth. She nodded, her throat tight. Yes, that night the village was restless, the air thick with unease. Some spoke of betrayal, others of mercy. The young woman sat alone in her cabin, the firelight flickering across her face. Her mother wept softly in the next room, her father silent as stone. She knew she had changed everything, that nothing would be the same again. Yet deep within her heart, she felt a strange calm, as though the storm had finally broken and the world was settling into its new shape in the days that followed. The Lakota camp remained by the river, but the threat of violence slowly eased. The settlers still whispered, still watched with wary eyes, but the moment of decision had passed without bloodshed. Life carried on, uneasy but alive. The young woman continued to walk to the river, her steps no longer hidden in shadows, but steady in the light of day. Each time the warrior was there, waiting with the same patience, his silence carrying everything words could not. Her father never spoke of it again, but his eyes softened when they met hers, as though he had accepted what he could not change. Her mother struggled, torn between fear and love, but over time even she could no longer deny the truth that shone in her daughter's face when she returned from the river. The warrior remained her anchor, his presence steady even as the world shifted around them. He told her stories of his people, of their strength, of their struggle to hold on to the land that gave them life. She listened, learning not only of him, but of the resilience of a people who refused to be erased. And in turn, she shared pieces of her own world, of the cabin, the fields, the life she had once thought she would never escape. Together, they built a space between two worlds, fragile but real. Seasons changed, and though suspicion never fully disappeared, neither did hope. The young woman and the warrior did not erase the conflict between their people, but they proved that love could exist even in the shadow of fear, that patience could outlast anger, that silence could hold more strength than violence. Their story spread in whispers, some harsh, some curious, some quietly moved. And though not everyone understood, no one could deny that something had shifted. Years later, when she looked back, she would remember not the whispers or the fear, but the night. By the river, when she stood between two worlds and chose her own path, she would remember the patience of the warrior, the weight of his silence, the strength that came not from defiance but from love. And she would remember the lesson that lingered long after the storm had passed, that love, even when fragile, could carve a space in the hardest of worlds. And in that space, hope could live. The river still flowed, carrying with it the stories of both peoples, weaving them together in ways neither had expected. And though the future remained uncertain, the young woman and the warrior walked it side by side, their hands steady, their hearts unshaken, their love a quiet defiance against the world that once sought to keep them apart. In the end, it was not fear that defined them, nor anger, nor judgment, but the courage to stand in the space between and choose each other. And that courage, born of patience and silence, became their legacy, a reminder that even in the harshest times, love could endure, and in enduring, it could change everything.